In his early life, E. E. Cummings was heavily supported by his mother. They had a very close connection, which is an important aspect when looking at this poem. It is said that she used to play games with her children and had a very close bond with them. Not only was she good with her children, she was good with her husband. She encouraged him to become a poet and pushed him to do the things he doubted within himself. This was important when it came to Cummings because it gave him the support he needed in the arts to excel in what he wanted to do. The title, If There Are Any Heavens, is an important part of the poem, as it brings up the topic heaven, and the if brings up the hypotheticals that E. E. Cummings imagined. In the first stanza, E. E. Cummings gives a topic, and he also starts using these parentheses we see throughout the poem. These are quite interesting because they're almost used to show the importance of a certain thing and to call attention to it. That'll be talked about later on. We then see him talk about this heaven that he's describing for his mother. He repeatedly uses these flowers as a way to symbolize what he's trying to say. It's interesting because he uses this throughout the whole text. However, in this stanza specifically, he uses it to bring out the characteristics of his mother. He talks about it not being a pansy heaven, which, although referencing the flower, could also mean like a weak heaven. He then talks about fragile heaven, so repeating the same idea, but then he gets into it calling it a heaven of black red roses. This is interesting because roses are usually seen as symbolism for passion, and the idea that the black red rose would mean to intensify this said passion. Then moving on to this section, as it's a bunch of smaller stanzas, he brings up the topic of his father, which, as we talked about earlier, his father the poet, his mother encouraged his father to become a poet, and this also was an influence for E. Cummings. So it's kind of tying back to that idea without straight up saying it. He then goes on to describe his father, talking about him being deep like a rose. This could either be seen as symbolism for his views or his morals, but it is most likely just to show the characteristics of his father. Then he talks about standing near my. It's kind of interesting how he doesn't say mother, but it's implied, especially when he goes on to say swaying over her silent. This kind of shows the importance of his dependence on her or their connection to each other. And then we get into eyes that are really like petals. This goes back to the thing in the previous stanza where he brings up the flowers. However, in this, it's almost seen as his perspective softens around her. She softens him, especially with the idea that she pushed him to become a poet. Moving on into the next stanza, he says, nothing with the face of a poet, therefore verifying what we just talked about in the last stanza. And then he goes on to say something about a flower and not a face with hands which whisper. This can be seen as the idea that he's softening, and it's not as it seems necessarily. About the idea that this is the beloved, and then in the last lines, it just shows the respect that everyone in the garden has for her, and it goes back to the idea that this whole poem is used to explain the kind of woman his mother is and who she was, and to see that the whole garden will bow and he will bow shows that this respect. Also, if you bring it back up to the first stanza, it also puts in the parentheses, which we talk about the importance of. She is all by herself, meaning that this heaven is just for her, meaning she was so good of a person in his eyes that she deserved a whole heaven. The whole point of E. E. Cummings' poem is to bring to light the importance of who she is and what she did and how people saw her. Going back and taking a closer look, we already went over title. Next, we also already went over paraphrasing. So if we go back to occasion, it seems to be more to honor his mother more than anything, and just explain the kind of person she is, and explain the relationship she had with people overall. His intentions seem very straightforward, but the way he's able to bring forth these emotions with the repetition of the flowers is something quite interesting. Then, if we move on to the tone, it seems more a tone of adoration. Pardon if I spell that wrong, because, it's AP Lit, right? And He seems to have a tone of affection and caring for his mother as he talks about what she deserves and her relationships with people and the way he reflects her with people bowing for her. He overall gives a tone of respect and adoration and love. And then moving on to theme. Moving on to the theme, it seems to overall be a theme of just love and respect for his mother and showing how important of a person she was on earth and how she'll be respected up in heaven. Because this is all about a hypothetical heaven in which he describes and makes for his mother. He uses the idea of the flowers in this building metaphor to represent who she is. The interesting thing is that a flower has several petals, right? And he kind of just goes and gives her a description for each petal. We see she's black-red, which is passion and affection and caring. And then he deepens that with the black-red, as it's a darker hue, meaning a stronger feeling. And then he brings into the context the relationship between her and her husband, as he brings about the idea of how he wanted to be a poet and how she pushed him to do that. So the other layer of the petal is his father and his mother. I can't speak. Then he goes on to talk about how everyone bows for her in this garden, and it shows the respect she has in the idea of a community. He builds her this whole character, and he uses the metaphor of a flower while unintentionally describing her as a flower. Last of all is speaker, and if it isn't clear enough, it is E.E. Cummings himself. Looking into the history and his early life, it's quite clear that the relationship between his mother was so strong, and the influence she had on her husband impacted not only her husband, but her son as well. And in this, we just see his love and adoration for her as the kind of person she is. The importance of this poem, however, is not that his mother is special, but the so what, the why. Why is she special? It's clear in the way he speaks about her that she's a great person, but what makes her so great? If we look back and we think about his early life as well, we learn a lot about him and the way his family maneuvers. The mother seems to be the bonding piece of their relationship in the family, pushing her husband and therein pushing Cummings. It's clear to see that the so what is more about the seed than the flower. It is the seed that would blossom the flower, which ties into this poem with the repetition. The way the mother influences the father and the children and the family as the bonding piece influences the way that Cummings grew up. And that's the importance of this, that the way you teach a child and influence them down at the seed impacts the way they are when they become a flower. To be less metaphorical, Cummings is essentially saying that the impact of a parent on a child at an influential age is important to the way that they develop. It is seen in the way that Cummings has pursued his passion through poetry and art because of his parents' influence on him.